There's a version of you that nobody can shake, a version that doesn't flinch when someone comes at you sideways, doesn't replay conversations at night, doesn't feel the need to prove, defend, or explain. Not because life suddenly became easier, but because something inside you became unmovable. Most people never reach that state. They spend years reacting, adjusting themselves to fit expectations, carrying words that were never worth holding, and without realizing it, they slowly hand over control of their inner world to things that were never meant to have it. Stoic philosophy points to a different path, not suppression, mastery. The understanding that your peace is not something to be negotiated with the outside world. It's something you build, something you protect. The moment you stop reacting to everything, something shifts. You begin to see how much of your energy was being spent on things that never deserved it. And in that awareness, a quieter kind of strength starts to form. It's not loud. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to prove anything, but it's steady, grounded, and once you feel it, even briefly, it becomes clear that there's a completely different way to move through the world. One where you are no longer pulled by everything around you. Most reactions are not decisions. They feel like they are. But look closer. They happen too fast, too automatically, almost like they were waiting for the moment to take over. Someone says something slightly off, and before you even process it, your body shifts, your tone changes, your mind starts building a response. Not chosen, just familiar. That's what most people miss. These reactions don't come from clarity. They come from conditioning, from patterns repeated so many times they start to feel like identity. And over time, you stop questioning them. You start calling them who you are. Anything automatic is something you don't fully control. And if you don't control it, it controls you. That's where the real loss happens. Not in what was said, but in how easily it moved you. Your state shifts, your focus shifts, your energy follows, all because something external gained access it didn't deserve. And it happened before awareness had a chance to step in, before the pause. And that pause is everything. That's where choice lives. Without it, there is no decision, only repetition. This is where Stoic thinking becomes practical. You don't control what happens, you control how you respond. But that only works if there is space between the two. If everything is instant, control never enters the picture. And most people live like that, reaction after reaction. All day, every day. They call it personality, they call it honesty, they call it being real. But if it isn't chosen, it isn't really you. It's just a pattern playing itself out. And patterns don't question themselves. They don't pause to ask if something is worth engaging with. They don't consider whether a response will improve anything or just feed the situation further. They just execute. Fast, predictable, mechanical. That's why reactions are easy to read. You push here, they respond there. The script rarely changes, and anything predictable can be influenced. That's the hidden cost of reactivity. It makes you easy to move, not because people are always trying to control you, but because they could, if they wanted to. The patterns are visible, the triggers are clear, and those triggers were built over time, through repetition, through reacting without awareness. Each moment added to the map, a map of how to reach you. But this is where things begin to change. The moment you notice the reaction before it fully takes over, something shifts. Even if it's just a second, a small delay, a moment of awareness, that's where control begins. Not by eliminating the reaction, but by seeing it. Because once you see it, you're no longer fully inside it. There's distance. And in that distance, there's choice. This is what Epictetus meant when he said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery isn't suppression. It's understanding. The ability to feel something without becoming it, to experience emotion without handing it control. That's where freedom begins. Not in controlling the world, but in no longer being controlled by your impulses. And the more you practice that pause, the clearer things become. You start to see how many reactions were unnecessary, how many moments would have passed on their own. Reacting doesn't resolve as much as it feels like it does. It extends things, gives them weight, keeps them alive, and slowly silence stops feeling like weakness. It starts to feel like discipline. If this way of thinking is something you want to build into your life, not just understand, but actually live, then consider subscribing. Not for content, but as a quiet commitment to becoming more aware, more grounded, and more in control of what truly matters. What you begin to realize is that control isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in small, quiet moments where you choose not to engage, where you feel the urge to respond, but you let it pass. Not because you can't respond, but because you don't need to. That shift, from needing to react to choosing whether to, is where everything changes. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes harder to go back. Because you've seen what it feels like to not be pulled by everything around you, to remain steady while things happen instead of because they happen. And that steadiness, that internal stability, starts to become more valuable than any temporary satisfaction a reaction could give you. If reacting is surrender, then silence begins to take on a completely different meaning. Not the kind of silence people associate with weakness, but a deliberate stillness. A refusal to participate in something that doesn't deserve your energy. Most people have been conditioned to believe that if something is said, it must be answered. If something is thrown at you, it must be caught and returned. That belief runs deep, and it shows up in subtle ways, in the urge to correct someone, in the need to defend your position, in the discomfort of letting a moment pass without stepping into it. But silence interrupts that entire pattern. It breaks the expectation that every action will be met with a reaction, and in doing so, it shifts the entire dynamic of the interaction. What makes silence powerful is not just the absence of words, but the presence of control. When someone directs something at you, they are, in a sense, initiating a loop. They act, expecting you to respond. That response completes the loop. It confirms that their action had an effect. It gives them feedback. It tells them that what they said or did reached you in some way. But when that response never comes, the loop stays open. There's no closure, no confirmation, just space. And in that space, something interesting begins to happen. The focus shifts away from you and back onto them. They are left alone with what they said without knowing how it landed or what it meant to you. That uncertainty creates tension, and most people are not comfortable with it. They rely on feedback to navigate social interactions. They look for cues, reactions, signals that tell them where they stand. When those signals disappear, it disrupts their sense of control. Suddenly, they are no longer guiding the interaction. They are guessing, interpreting, filling in gaps with their own assumptions. And often, those assumptions say more about them than anything you could have responded with. Silence, in this way, becomes a mirror. It reflects people back to themselves without interference. This is why being unreadable can feel unsettling to others, not because you are doing anything aggressive, but because you are not participating in the usual exchange. There's no immediate reaction to analyze, no emotional cue to latch onto, just calm, steady presence. And that presence, when it's genuine, carries a certain weight. It suggests that you are not easily moved, that your internal state is not dependent on what just happened. And that alone changes how people engage with you, because if they can't influence your reactions, they lose a certain level of control they might not have even realized they had. Silence also protects something that reactions often expose. Every time you respond emotionally, you reveal information. What bothers you, what you care about, where your boundaries are soft. That information doesn't just disappear, it gets stored, consciously or not, by the people around you. And over time it creates a kind of map, a way to predict how you might respond in the future. But when you choose silence, especially in moments where a reaction is expected, you give nothing away. No data, no emotional cues, just stillness, and that makes you harder to read, harder to predict, and ultimately harder to influence. There's a discipline to this that goes beyond simply not speaking. It's not about forcing yourself to stay quiet while internally reacting just as strongly as before. That kind of silence is fragile. It eventually breaks. Real silence comes from a different place. A place where the need to respond has already been questioned, where the impulse to engage has been examined and let go of. That kind of silence doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like clarity, like seeing something for what it is and deciding it doesn't require your involvement. And this clarity builds over time. The more you allow moments to pass without reacting, the more you start to see how many of them were never worth your energy in the first place. How many situations resolve themselves without your input? How many comments lose their weight when they are not acknowledged? It becomes clear that not everything needs your attention, and certainly not everything deserves your response. That realization is quiet, but it changes the way you move through the world. There's also a shift in how you perceive strength. It stops being about having the right comeback or winning the moment. It becomes about maintaining your state regardless of what happens, about staying grounded when something tries to pull you out of that position. And in that sense, silence is not passive at all. It is active restraint, a conscious decision not to engage, a decision that often requires more control than reacting ever would. This aligns closely with what Marcus Aurelius captured when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That strength doesn't come from dominating situations or controlling outcomes. It comes from understanding where your influence actually lies and choosing to operate within it. Silence becomes one of the clearest expressions of that understanding, not because it avoids conflict, but because it refuses to be controlled by it. Over time, this way of responding, or not responding, starts to reshape your interactions entirely. People begin to sense that you are not easily drawn into unnecessary exchanges, that your attention is not freely given to every situation that demands it, and with that comes a shift in how they approach you. Not always consciously, but noticeably. Because when someone realizes they can't easily provoke a reaction, they either adjust their behavior or lose interest altogether. And in either case, you remain unchanged. Not because nothing happens around you, but because you've stopped allowing everything to reach you in the same way. That is where silence becomes more than just a response. It becomes a boundary, one that doesn't need to be explained or defended. It simply exists, quietly shaping the way you engage with the world while keeping your control exactly where it belongs. It often comes down to something deeper than the moment itself. Not the comment, not the situation, not even the tone, but the quiet need underneath it. The need to be understood, to be seen correctly, to make sure that what someone thinks about you aligns with what you believe about yourself. And that need can feel reasonable at first, almost justified. After all, no one wants to be misunderstood. No one wants to be reduced to a version of themselves that doesn't feel accurate. So the instinct is to step in, to clarify, to explain, to reshape the narrative before it settles into something permanent. But there's a subtle shift that happens in that process, one that most people don't notice until it's already become a habit. Because the moment you begin explaining yourself to someone who has already formed a conclusion about you, the dynamic changes. You're no longer just communicating. You're negotiating, not facts, not reality, but identity. You're trying to move their perception from one place to another, hoping that if you say the right thing in the right way, they'll see you differently. But perception doesn't always work like that. It isn't built purely on logic or evidence. It's shaped by bias, by prior beliefs, by emotions that have nothing to do with you. And once someone has settled into a certain view, especially one that serves their own narrative, Changing it becomes far more difficult than it seems. That's where the real question begins to take shape. When you explain yourself in those situations, what are you actually doing? Are you revealing truth, or are you trying to gain approval? Are you clarifying reality, or are you adjusting yourself to fit into someone else's version of it? Because those are not the same thing, and the more often you step into that space, the more you reinforce a quiet dependence on how you are perceived. A dependence that slowly shifts your focus away from who you are and toward how you are seen. This is where Stoic thinking cuts through the noise with a kind of clarity that can feel uncomfortable at first. It draws a hard line between what is within your control and what is not. Your thoughts, your actions, your decisions, that's yours. But someone else's opinion, their interpretation of you, that has never belonged to you, not even for a moment. And yet, so much energy gets spent trying to manage it, trying to influence something that was never yours to influence in the first place. There's a certain illusion at play here. The belief that if you don't explain yourself, the misunderstanding will define you. That silence equals acceptance. That if you don't step in, their version becomes the truth. But truth doesn't operate that way. It isn't determined by who speaks the loudest or who explains the most. It exists independently of perception. The problem is, most people don't trust that. They feel the need to constantly reinforce who they are through words, through explanations, through corrections. And in doing so, they tie their sense of identity to something external and unstable. Over time, this creates a kind of tension, a subtle but persistent feeling that you need to keep adjusting, keep clarifying, keep making sure you're being seen the right way. And that tension doesn't just stay in isolated moments. It starts to shape how you move through the world. You become more cautious, more reactive, more aware of how everything might be interpreted. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to lose something important, your independence from other people's perceptions. That's why stepping back from this pattern can feel so unnatural at first. Choosing not to explain when you know you're being misunderstood goes against everything you've been conditioned to do. It feels like you're leaving something unfinished, like you're allowing an incorrect version of yourself to exist without correction. But what you're actually doing is reclaiming something that was never meant to be outsourced, your sense of self. This doesn't mean you never communicate or never clarify. There are moments where explanation is appropriate, where dialogue matters, where understanding can be reached. But those moments are different. They are grounded in mutual respect, in a genuine openness to see things clearly. Not in a one-sided effort to convince someone who has already decided not to understand you. And learning to recognize that difference changes everything. Because once you see it, the need to explain begins to lose its urgency. You start to realize that not every misunderstanding requires your involvement, that not every perception needs to be corrected, that sometimes the most grounded response is no response at all. Not out of avoidance, but out of clarity. A clear understanding of what is yours to manage and what is not. What remains is how you handled it. Whether you stayed grounded or got pulled into something unnecessary. Whether you held on to your sense of self or handed it over, even briefly, to someone else's opinion. And over time, those choices begin to shape something deeper than any single interaction. They shape your relationship with yourself. Because when you stop trying to manage how you are perceived, you free up a significant amount of energy. Energy that can be redirected towards something more stable, more meaningful. Your own actions, your own standards, your own direction. Instead of constantly looking outward for validation or correction, you begin to anchor yourself inward. And that shift, while quiet, is powerful. It doesn't make you indifferent in the sense of not caring. It makes you selective, careful about where your energy goes, aware of what actually deserves your attention. And that awareness becomes a kind of filter, one that protects you from getting pulled into every situation that invites a reaction, an explanation, or a defense. In the end, the goal is not to control how others see you. That was never possible. The goal is to become so clear on who you are that their perception no longer dictates your behavior. And once you reach that point, the need to explain begins to fade on its own, not because you forced it away, but because you've outgrown it. Because now it's no longer about the original situation. It's about managing an image, maintaining a version of yourself that exists in someone else's mind. And that version is not stable. It shifts based on their mood, their perspective, their own internal narratives, which means you are constantly adapting to something that is constantly changing. That's where the entanglement begins. Slowly, subtly, you become more focused on how you are being perceived than on how you are actually living. And that shift, while easy to miss, comes at a cost. The cost is freedom, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, persistent way. You start filtering your actions through the lens of interpretation. You think about how something might be seen before you even do it. You adjust your behavior to avoid being misunderstood. And in doing so, you move further away from something simple but important: alignment with yourself. Instead of acting from clarity, you act from anticipation. Anticipation of judgment, of reaction, of perception. And that anticipation becomes a kind of invisible pressure that shapes your decisions without you fully noticing it. There's also a deeper layer to this. Much of what people project onto you has very little to do with you. It reflects their own experiences, insecurities, expectations. The way someone interprets your silence, your words, your actions often says more about their internal world than it does about yours. But when you take responsibility for correcting every misunderstanding, you unintentionally take ownership of those projections as well. You begin to treat them as problems you need to solve, rather than perspectives you don't control. And that misplacement of responsibility keeps you engaged in something that was never yours to carry. Stepping out of that pattern requires a shift that feels uncomfortable at first. Not because it's wrong, but because it goes against the instinct to fix, to clarify, to be understood. It requires you to accept that some people will see you incorrectly, that some narratives will exist without your input, that not every misunderstanding will be resolved. And instead of reacting to that, instead of trying to correct it, you allow it to exist without interference, not as a form of defeat, but as a form of clarity, a recognition that your role is not to manage perception, but to live in alignment with what you know to be true. This is where detachment begins to take shape, not as indifference, but as a form of discipline, a decision to stop engaging with something that doesn't lead anywhere meaningful. When you detach from the need to control how you are seen, you create space. Space to act without constantly second-guessing. Space to move without constantly adjusting. And in that space, something shifts internally. You become less reactive, less entangled, less dependent on external validation or correction. Carl Jung captured this dynamic in a way that cuts straight to the core when he wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That idea flips the focus entirely. Instead of trying to fix how others see you, you begin to observe what their reactions reveal about them and sometimes about you. It becomes less about correcting and more about understanding. And that understanding creates distance. Not emotional distance in a cold sense, but psychological distance. Enough space to see things clearly without being pulled into them. From that position, your actions start to change naturally, not because you are forcing yourself to be different, but because you are no longer operating under the same pressure. You don't feel the need to respond to every interpretation. You don't feel compelled to explain every decision. You begin to trust that your actions, over time, will speak more clearly than any explanation ever could. And if they don't, if someone still chooses to see you a certain way, that becomes something you can accept without needing to intervene. Over time, this selectivity becomes part of how you move through the world. You stop getting pulled into unnecessary cycles. You stop engaging with narratives that don't serve you. And most importantly, you stop measuring yourself through the lens of someone else's perception. Because once you see how unstable that lens is, it loses its authority over you. What remains is something quieter but far more stable, a sense of alignment that doesn't depend on external validation, a way of being that isn't constantly adjusting itself to fit into shifting interpretations. And in that stability, the need to explain, to correct, to manage begins to fade, not because you've forced it away, but because it no longer feels necessary. Most conflicts don't exist in isolation. They grow through engagement, through responses, counter-responses, interpretations and reactions layered on top of each other. One comment leads to another. One misunderstanding expands into something bigger. And before long, what started as something small becomes something that feels significant, even overwhelming. But that growth doesn't happen on its own. It requires energy. It requires attention. It requires someone to keep it moving forward. And that's the part most people don't question. They step into these cycles without realizing that their involvement is what allows the situation to continue. When you remove that involvement, something shifts. Not always in a dramatic way, not instantly, but consistently. The cycle loses momentum. Without a reaction to build on, there's nothing to expand. Without engagement, there's nothing to escalate. It's like a fire without fuel. It might burn for a moment, but it doesn't last. And in that absence, you begin to see how many situations were sustained not by their importance, but by your attention to them. That realization is quiet, but it's significant. It changes how you approach things moving forward. This doesn't mean everything disappears immediately. Some situations linger. Some people continue their behavior regardless of your response. But even then, the dynamic is different. You are no longer contributing to it. You are no longer reinforcing it. And over time, that lack of reinforcement has an effect. Not always on the other person, but on you. You become less invested, less affected, less drawn into things that once would have consumed your attention. And that shift begins to create something new internally. What starts to form is stability. Not the kind that depends on everything going smoothly, but the kind that exists regardless of what's happening around you. A steady sense of self that isn't constantly adjusting to external input. Because when you stop reacting to everything, you also stop allowing everything to shape you. Your identity becomes less reactive, less fluid in response to outside forces, and more grounded in something consistent. Something that doesn't change every time someone says or does something unexpected. This is where the difference between performative strength and real strength becomes clear. Performative strength needs to be seen. It needs to respond, to assert itself, to make sure others recognize it. It reacts quickly, often loudly, because it's tied to how it appears. But real strength doesn't operate that way. It doesn't need to prove itself in every moment. It doesn't feel threatened by silence. It understands that not every situation requires a response, and that choosing not to engage is often the more controlled, more deliberate option. Over time, this way of operating becomes less about effort and more about habit. The same way reactions once felt automatic, restraint begins to feel natural. Not forced, not rigid, but steady. You don't need to remind yourself constantly. You don't need to analyze every situation. There's just a quiet understanding of what deserves your attention and what doesn't. And that understanding guides your behavior without the same internal conflict that used to exist. That presence is noticeable, even if it's not loud. People sense it, not always consciously, but they feel the difference, the lack of reactivity, the steadiness, the absence of unnecessary engagement. And that changes how they interact with you. Not because you're trying to influence them, but because you're no longer participating in the same patterns. And when patterns change, dynamics follow. What remains is something simple but powerful,